I'd probably say that layering, filling and coating your cake with a nice even clean surface with a lovely sharp edge is probably one of the most important things and is really the foundation of a really nice clean looking cake. And in this short tutorial, I'm just going to show you how I like to layer my cakes and just give you a few tips on how you can achieve the best results ready to ice a cake in fondant. Once you've baked your cake, let it cool down to room temperature, and then I like to wrap my cakes in cling film and store them in the fridge until they're really nice and chilled. It's much easier working with chilled cake as opposed to one that's been freshly baked that's really soft and you're unable to get nice clean cuts when you go to cut it or to layer it. I prefer to bake my cakes always the day before and then I'll layer them the next day, so that gives them all night just to rest, and then when I go to cut them they won't be as crumbly and they won't fall apart when you're trying to handle them. The cake I've got here is just going to be a really small cake, just a 4-inch round cake, and rather than baking it in 4-inch tins like I do for the larger cakes, for this cake I like to bake it in a square so you don't have any crust at all around the outside. Being a small cake, it's nice just to get cake right to the outer edge and no crust on it at all. So I'm starting here with just a 9-inch cake, and I've baked it probably about 1.5 inches deep. You can refer to my vanilla butter cake recipe, which you'll also find on the platform, which is usually my standard go-to recipe for all of my butter cakes, and I just flavour them accordingly. The one I'm going to be doing here for this tutorial is actually a really lovely, one of my favourite flavours. It's going to be lemon and elderflower. So to flavour this particular sponge, I've just added some lemon zest at this stage, and then I'm going to add some lemon syrup and elderflower syrup together with some lemon curd a bit later on. To start with, I always like to just trim the bottom of the cakes first, so removing all of that brown crust that can be quite dry. To trim the top of the cake, I'm lucky enough to have an agbe. They're quite expensive, but actually they're really worth investing in. I only got mine probably last year and I've managed all this time without one. But if you have got the chance to get one, I definitely recommend it because it's just so much quicker than trying to do it all by hand. I like to start off by just cutting my 9-inch cake into 4, and then you can just work on each piece at a time. Place your 4-inch card on the top of each piece and just cut round it. You'll notice that I'm actually moving the card slightly each time I turn the pieces. By moving it slightly off center and over the edge that I've just cut, you'll end up with a nice circular piece that's actually a little bit smaller than your cake card, which is what you want. So when you go to coat it in ganache later on, you'll be able to create a slightly wider border than if you bring the cake all the way to the edge of the card. To start off the layering, smear a tiny amount of buttercream onto the cake card. Here I've got just a chopping board or any large board would do, and I've placed that on top of my turntable. This is just so when the cake's actually layered, I can move it easily off the turntable and into the fridge to chill. Before I place my first piece of cake onto the cake card, I'm just brushing it with some lemon and elderflower syrup. So I made this just by mixing a small amount of lemon juice with some sugar and bringing that to the boil to make like a lemon syrup, and then I added just some straight elderflower cordial. And I've included the recipe for this in the class materials so you'll be able to see. Once your first layer is down, then again brush some more with the syrup, and then you can put a nice amount of buttercream on. The buttercream here I've just again flavoured with some lemon zest. Make sure you try it as you make things. It's important to taste how lemony the buttercream is. You want the taste to be there, but it doesn't need to be too strong, because now I'm going to add some lemon curd, and this will really help intensify the lemon flavour. So now you just want to repeat the process for all of the layers. Brush each side with syrup and then just layer with the buttercream and then the lemon curd. It's up to you if you want to go ahead and put the lemon curd on top of the buttercream like I did for the first layer, or you can even brush your next piece with syrup and then put the lemon curd straight onto your other piece and then place that upside down onto your already prepared buttercream. Try to spread the buttercream and the curd just as evenly as possible when you're doing this. It will just help the shape stay more level as you build the cake up, rather than ending up looking like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's also important as well, while you're working with the buttercream, that it's quite soft and easy to work with. You don't want it really soft that it's just going to ooze straight out and squish down when you're pressing down on all the layers. But you don't want it to be too stiff that when you're working with it, it starts pulling away the cake. You also don't need to worry too much about going right to the edges with the buttercream and the curd, because when you do push down a bit, you'll see at the end, you don't want it to ooze out too much. And you'll see in a minute that I'm just creating a little gutter with my finger just to bring that buttercream back in. So when it's all layered and looking lovely, it could still be quite soft and likely to move a little bit when you're trying to ganache it. So at this stage, if it is feeling soft, and especially with the smaller cakes, because I find they do move a little bit, I always prefer to just wrap it in some cling and then place it in the fridge just to firm up before I then go ahead and start ganaching. Now my cake's been in the fridge probably for about 10 minutes, just give me enough time to clean up and to do a few jobs. And now it's nice and firm enough, I'm ready to go and coat it with some ganache. I'm using ganache simply for the fact that at room temperature it sets much firmer than buttercream, meaning that you can get a nicer shape on the outside of the cake and a nice firm surface on which to lay your fondant, so you can create a much sharper edge. Before I start the coating, I always like to just run around the edge of the cakes with my serrated knife, just to take off any extra bits of cake that's sticking out past the edge of my board. Once you've done that, just be sure to remove any crumbs so you're working with a nice clean surface, and when you're ganaching you're not going to get any of those loose crumbs going back into the ganache. You also want to make sure that the top of the cake has also been syruped, just to help add some extra moisture and flavour. Usually for most cakes I use white chocolate ganache. I find that with the darker chocolate ganache, and when I'm often doing white cakes, you can see that darker colour coming through very slightly. Because the fondant is so thin, it does show up and you don't get as much of a lighter, whiter fondant. You want to make sure the ganache is nice and soft at this stage. Again, if it's too stiff, just like I mentioned with the buttercream, it's going to start pulling away your cake. For my first layer of ganache, I normally start with the sides and then do the top afterwards, but it really doesn't matter. I just do the sides out of habit. I like to make sure that my ganache is securing in around the base of the cake, and then I gradually work up towards the top. The important thing is just to keep your palette knife flat against the cake and either in a vertical position for the sides and a horizontal position for the top. Once you start holding your knife on strange angles, you're going to find it really hard to get a nice sharp edge at the top of the cake. Once you've covered the entire cake, then you can go and use your scraper. I absolutely love using these Choctastic scrapers. They're just metal scrapers and they're fairly high. The one I'm using here is actually 8 inches high, and it's probably the one I use the most. Usually my cakes are between, say, 5.5 and 6 inches deep, so this one's absolutely perfect. Now when you're using your scraper, you want to make sure that it's always at 90 degrees. By placing the bottom edge on the board and keeping that there and working all of the way around with the side of the scraper against the side of the cake, you should have a nice 90-degree angle running all the way around the cake. As well as the angle around the side of the cake, you also want to make sure that the top of your cake is nice and flat. So make sure you hold the scraper in a completely horizontal position to create a nice sharp edge between the top and the sides of the cake. Now you need to just place this in the fridge for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, just so the ganache firms up, and then you're ready to do your next coat. Now the ganache is nice and firm and I'm ready just to finish off. Probably 2 coats will be enough, especially for the smaller cakes. It's important to think as well just about the final design of your cake when you're ganaching. If the cake's going to be covered in lots of flowers and lots of decorative work, you really don't need to make your ganaching and your fondant covering really perfect. Always step back and think, is it really important that I spend lots of time on this step, or can I just leave it, maybe at 90% perfect and then concentrate more on the decorations that are going on top? Usually for the smaller cakes, I'm able to get away with just doing 2 coats. By 2 coats, I just mean 2 times spreading on ganache and placing it in the fridge to firm up. For this second layer, I like to spread some on and then use my scraper just to clean it up again. Then I'll just go again without placing it back in the fridge, because you'll see that the cake's already quite cold from being in the fridge from before, and the ganache that you put on there straight away is just going to set. So you don't actually need to put it back in the fridge, just the chilled cake from before will just help it go hard. So then you can just carry on adding more ganache and filling in those gaps. Keep using your metal scraper just to take off and just to neaten up the sides. You're also wanting to work along the top as well. I find that doing this method works really well. You can spread some on and then scrape off. Sometimes you'll find that you end up doing this perhaps too much, and as the cake starts to come more to room temperature, you end up starting to dislodge some of the first layer of ganache. At this point it can get really annoying and messy, so you'll need to just place it back into the fridge to firm up before you carry on ganaching. Don't forget, just make sure you keep your scraper at 90 degrees when you're doing the sides, and then when you're doing the top of the cake as well, you want to make sure it's nice and level and 90 degrees with the sides. Now there are tools you can use to help you achieve this, but I prefer just to be able to do this by hand. It's a really good skill to have. By hand, I just mean by eye, using just my scraper to make the sides and the tops nice and straight. That's not to say I don't use the other methods to layer my cakes. I do have a Pro Froster, which is basically kind of like a set square tool where you have the top scraper and the side scraper. They're set together at 90 degrees, meaning that you can go around the cake and have a straight edge and a straight top. But really, to do this by hand is so much quicker. And when you're making cakes, being quick and getting this part down to a fine art is a really good skill to have. You'll notice here how I'm concentrating on the sides first, and when I'm happy the sides are all level and all the little dents and so on have been filled out, I'll then go in across the top and really try and sharpen those top edges and bring the ganache that's sticking up above the cake inwards to create a flat surface. Another good tip I'll just share with you is just if you are having trouble smoothing all those finer details out at the very end, it might help just by running your scraper under some hot water for a few seconds and then just drying it off before you just go over everything once. This might just help smooth out all those fine lines if you haven't been able to do that already. When you're happy with the ganache finish and you have a nice sharp edge, place it back in the fridge to firm up. Ideally, you want it to be in the fridge for about 20 minutes just to make sure that the cake is chilled and that the filling is chilled as well. Once you're happy that everything's set, you can bring the cake out and let it sit at room temperature. It's great if you've got air conditioning. Ideally, you want to be working in a kitchen that's probably around 15 to 20 degrees, and that way you'll find that the buttercream stays firm enough, you won't get any bulging, and that the fondant will dry out nicely and won't sweat too much.